Right there at my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law called for security. This is a high-end event. Remove these two uninvited guests. I stood there holding my wife's hand, hearing those words cut through the music and the clinking glasses. The irony was hard to miss. I was the one who paid for everything around us. My son lowered his head. He whispered that I was embarrassing him. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned and walked toward the gate. And in that moment, something inside me quietly shut down. Before I go on, take a second to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your presence gives me a reason to keep speaking. And next, I'll tell you why that single moment at the wedding shattered everything I once believed was solid. My wife and I didn't turn away right after those words were spoken. We stood there for a few more seconds, long enough to understand that something had shifted, not because of Brielle's sharp command, but because of my son's silence. Jackson stood there right at the entrance of the ceremony in a carefully tailored suit. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His gaze drifted away, as if I were a flaw in the perfect picture he was trying to display to his wife's family. My wife squeezed my hand. That hand had held mine for more than 40 years, through the days when all we had was a damp, rented room and meals counted down to the last dollar. She was wearing an old dress, the dress she had kept from our own wedding. I knew why she chose it, not to relive the past, but to remind herself of everything we had survived. In the middle of this lavish celebration, that dress looked out of place. And that's when I understood why they were uncomfortable. Brielle stood blocking the aisle. Her voice was high and clear, loud enough for people nearby to hear. She didn't need to explain anything. The way she looked at us was the way someone looks at a stain that doesn't belong. The Miller family sat in the front row. They exchanged glances, thin smiles, cold ones. No one stood up. No one asked who we were. They already had their answer. Jackson stepped closer. He spoke softly, but every word landed. He said we were embarrassing him. He said Brielle's family were people who belonged here. He said we should leave before things became more awkward. I looked at my son, trying to find the boy who used to run after me in the workshop, asking why my hands always smelled like machine oil. I couldn't find him. All I saw was a grown man, afraid of losing his place in a room that still wasn't his. I opened my mouth to speak, not to argue, just to end things with some dignity. But my wife shook her head. She didn't say a word. She only tugged my hand a little tighter, a quiet reminder that sometimes silence is the only way to keep the last piece of self-respect you have left. I nodded. I learned a long time ago, not every battle needs a voice. Security walked over. They weren't rough. They did exactly what they were told to do. Polite, efficient. That made everything even clearer. We were escorted out, like two guests who had wandered into the wrong place. When the large gates closed behind us, the music inside kept playing. Steady, uninterrupted. No one stopped. No one looked back. I heard laughter behind us, not loud, but clear enough to know where it came from. The Miller family was relieved. A problem had been handled. I didn't turn around. I knew if I did, that image would stay with me for too long, and I didn't want to carry it. Outside the gate, the sea wind blew in, salty and cold. My wife stood beside me quietly, straightening the folds of her dress. I asked if she was okay. She nodded, but her eyes were red, not because she felt insulted, but because she understood the same thing I had just realized. We hadn't only been removed from a wedding. We had just been pushed out of a life we had spent our entire adulthood building. We walked slowly down the stone path toward the parking lot. I carried a small gift wrapped in newspaper. It was light, but my hand felt heavier than usual. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside, and I knew it wouldn't be given today. As we left, I didn't say a word. Fragments of memory drifted through my mind. Nights spent sleeping at the warehouse to meet early shipments, the way my wife carefully wrote down every expense so we wouldn't go beyond what we could afford. I don't regret those years. What surprised me was realizing that to my own son, none of it seemed to matter anymore. When we got into the car, I looked back at the mansion one last time. The lights were bright. The glass reflected the dark ocean. Everything looked perfect, but I knew beneath that perfection were foundations that weren't solid. And in that moment, I understood something else. From the second those gates closed, I was no longer just the man who had been humiliated. I had become the man who would decide whether those foundations would hold or begin to crack. I started the engine. My wife placed her hand over mine. No words were needed. We drove away in silence, carrying a familiar kind of cold, the kind you feel when one door has just closed and another one is quietly waiting to be opened. We didn't drive straight home. The coastal road led us to a small diner. Dim yellow lights, the smell of old coffee in the air. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds. After what had just happened, I needed a place without music, without curious eyes, just a table, 2 chairs, and enough quiet to hear my own thoughts. My wife sat across from me. She removed the hair clip and placed it on the table, the way she always did when she wanted to talk seriously. I knew that signal. She didn't cry. That worried me more. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Maybe we should open the gift." Her voice was calm, as if this were just another ordinary evening. I nodded. I unfolded the newspaper, wrapping carefully. Inside wasn't jewelry. Nothing flashy. Just a thin folder. On top was the transfer document for the beachfront villa, the one Jackson once said he only dared to dream about. I clearly remembered the moment my wife suggested giving it as a wedding gift. She said we didn't need grand ceremonies. What mattered was that our son had solid ground to stand on. Back then, I agreed without hesitation. I closed the folder. There was nothing to discuss. My wife understood the moment she met my eyes. She pulled the folder toward her and rested her hand on it, like placing a final period at the end of an old intention. No words were spoken, but I knew we had made the same decision. I took out my phone. The contact list showed familiar names, people who had been with me since the days when the company was nothing more than a rented warehouse. I called my assistant. I didn't explain much. I told them to stop all payments related to the wedding, deposits, pending services. Everything shut down that night. There was a brief pause on the other end, but no questions. They were used to the way I made decisions. The next call was about the assets under Jackson's name. I ordered them frozen, reviewed. No changes allowed for now. I didn't call it punishment. I called it necessary control. When I hung up, the tight weight in my chest eased a little. Not because I felt satisfied, but because order was returning. Only then did my wife speak again. She said there was something I needed to know. She hadn't told me earlier because she didn't want me to see our son differently before the wedding. She opened her purse and took out another stack of papers. Thicker, neatly clipped, transaction records, loans, and names I recognized immediately. The Miller family. She said that for months she had quietly checked. Not out of suspicion, but out of a mother's instinct. The Miller family wasn't as wealthy as they appeared. They were carrying heavy debt, and this extravagant wedding wasn't a blessing. It was a cover, a way to impress, a way to pull Jackson deeper into commitments he didn't fully understand. I flipped through the pages. The figures were clear, cold. I wasn't angry. I felt familiar with it. Throughout my career, I'd seen too many people wear polished surfaces to hide cracked foundations. What bothered me wasn't the debt. It was that my son had chosen to believe the surface and turned his back on the very people who taught him how to stand. My wife added one more thing. The largest debt the Millers carried was with a bank I knew very well, not because I had friends there, but because my company handled the collateral. In other words, their financial future rested on decisions I could directly influence. She didn't say it as a threat, just as a fact that needed to be placed where it belonged. We sat there for a long time. Outside, the diner slowly emptied. I looked at my wife and realized the calm on her face wasn't resignation. It was preparation. She didn't want revenge. She wanted clarity, so no one could later say they didn't know what ground they were standing on. When we left, it was fully dark. I took a deep breath. The cold air cleared my head. I didn't feel like I was stepping into a confrontation. I was simply returning to a role I knew well, the one responsible for difficult decisions. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I thought about Jackson, about the way he lowered his head, not out of respect, but out of fear of being seen with us. I understood then that without a clear boundary, everything would keep sliding in the wrong direction. When we stopped in front of the house, I already knew my next step. Not talking, not explaining. Action. Tomorrow, I would go to the company. Not to announce anything, but to observe. To see how those standing confidently on my name would behave when they believed I was no longer there. I held my wife's hand as we walked inside. She squeezed gently, a reminder that we were still walking together. That night I slept very little, but in that long wakefulness, I no longer felt pushed aside. I knew I was exactly where I needed to be, to see everything clearly, and to prepare for the moment when the truth would speak for itself. The next morning I arrived at the company headquarters earlier than usual, not because of urgent work, but because I wanted to see everything before it had time to put on its familiar polished face. I didn't enter through the front door. I parked in the back lot, where few people paid attention. I wanted to observe before I appeared. From upstairs through the internal camera system, I watched the main lobby slowly fill up. Employees began their shifts. The atmosphere looked like any other day, but I knew this one would be different. Jackson and Brielle would be coming in. They believed that after the wedding everything was settled. Titles, authority, the recognition they expected, already waiting for them. My wife arrived not long after I did. She wore simple clothes, light gray, with an old baseball cap pulled low. If you didn't know her, you'd never recognize her. She said she wanted to walk around on her own. No escort. I understood what she meant. This wasn't a test. It was her way of looking again at the place she had devoted her life to, from a different angle. Close to noon, Jackson appeared. Brielle was with him. She walked into the lobby with the familiar posture of someone who believed she belonged there. Her eyes swept past the reception desk, past employees focused on their work. No greeting, just the assumption that everything should move aside. At that moment, my wife was pushing a floor-cleaning cart near the elevators. Her head was lowered. She was doing her job. I watched through the screen, my heartbeat slowing. Not from worry, but because I knew there were moments you couldn't interfere with, if you wanted to see the truth. Brielle walked quickly. Her heels hit the freshly cleaned floor. She stopped abruptly. Her voice rang out, not loud but sharp. She complained about the wet floor, about her shoes being stained. Then her hand lifted. Not a violent act, but a gesture strong enough to make someone freeze. I saw my wife step back slightly and remain silent. Jackson stood beside her. He watched it happen. I waited for a reaction. What I saw instead was cold agreement. He said people working on the lower levels should know their place. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but I heard it clearly. He didn't know that every word was being recorded. I didn't turn off the camera. I wanted to see how far it would go. A few other employees paused, looked, then turned away. No one spoke. Silence spread quickly. I'd seen that kind of silence many times, in tense meetings. It wasn't agreement. It was fear. My wife bent down and continued working. No explanation, no apology, no reaction. That calm made the scene heavier than anything else. Brielle let out a quiet scoff and pulled Jackson toward the elevator. The doors closed. The lobby returned to its usual rhythm, but I knew what had just happened wouldn't disappear. I turned off the screen. There was no burst of anger in my mind, only a cold confirmation. What happened at the wedding wasn't a moment of impulse. It was part of how they saw the world. And today they had brought that view into the very place they believed they were about to control. My wife came up to my office not long after. She took off the cap and set it on the desk. I asked if she was okay. She shook her head no, then said she only wanted to know one thing. When no one knows who you are, how do they treat you? She had her answer. We didn't talk much after that. There was no need. I knew the next step was close. Jackson and Brielle wouldn't wait long. They believed today was the day they would be recognized. A board meeting had already been scheduled under the title of New Strategic Direction. I had agreed to attend, but hadn't announced when I would appear. That afternoon, I stood in the small room behind the main conference hall, where you could see inside through one-way glass. The Miller family was there too. They were well-dressed, confident. I caught fragments of conversation about the future, about expansion, about things they had never built with their own hands. Jackson sat in the central seat, back straight, eyes eager. I didn't go in right away. I let them talk. I let them believe everything was unfolding according to their plan. With each passing minute, the atmosphere in the room grew more certain, as if power had already been theirs for a long time. My wife stood beside me. She didn't look into the meeting room. She looked at me. Her eyes weren't urging anything. They simply said we had gone too far to turn back now. When the secretary stepped out and said the board was present and ready to begin, I nodded. I adjusted my cuff, took a slow breath. I knew the next moment wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't require raised voices, but it would be the point where everything hidden would begin to surface. I opened the door, and this time, I walked straight in. The conference room door closed softly behind me. No one noticed right away. They were busy talking, laughing, sketching out plans they believed were already in their hands. I stood still for a few seconds, long enough to clearly hear Jackson explaining the new future of the company, as if he had been leading it for years. Then, someone noticed me. Silence spread slowly, like a crack moving across glass. One by one, eyes turned in my direction. Jackson stopped mid-sentence. Brielle hesitated for a brief moment, then quickly pulled herself together. The Miller family looked at me with surprise mixed with irritation, as if my presence wasn't part of their script. I didn't speak right away. I pulled out the chairman's chair and sat down. My wife followed me in and placed a thick folder on the table right at the center of the room. The sound of it touching the surface wasn't loud, but it was enough. I looked around. No one asked why we were there. Maybe because deep down they already knew. Jackson broke the silence first. He said this meeting was meant to finalize the transfer of executive authority. He said it was time for the older generation to step aside. His voice tried to stay calm, but I could hear the impatience underneath. I nodded, signaling for him to continue. I wanted him to finish. When Jackson was done, I finally spoke. I spoke slowly, making sure no word was missed. I asked whether, before talking about the future, we had taken an honest look at the present. I gestured to my wife. She opened the folder and slid it toward the Miller family. The first pages were loan records. Clear amounts. Specific dates. No long explanation needed. Mr. and Mrs. Miller's expressions began to change. Brielle leaned forward to look, then sat back upright, trying to stay composed. I said that debt by itself wasn't the problem. If it was handled transparently, the problem was choosing to hide it and using a marriage as a shortcut. No one interrupted me. I went on. I spoke about the wedding, about the display, about the way people were treated when they were labeled as not belonging. I didn't say any names. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly what I meant. At that point, my wife removed the shawl from her shoulders. She sat up straight. Her voice was heard for the first time in the meeting. She said there was one crucial detail everyone had overlooked. She was the one who held the majority of the company's shares, not in name, not through inheritance, but because she had quietly stood behind the most important decisions for many years. The room went still. Jackson turned to look at his mother, confusion filling his eyes. Brielle opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. The Miller family could no longer maintain their earlier confidence. I looked at my son and saw the collapse in his gaze, not from losing power, but from realizing he had never truly understood his own family. I said that authority isn't something handed over just because of blood. It comes from responsibility and from how a person treats those around them. I repeated a question I once asked Jackson when he was a boy. If you're standing on a foundation, do you know who built it? Back then he didn't answer. Today he didn't either. Brielle suddenly stood up. She said none of this was fair. She said we were trying to destroy their lives. I looked at her, without anger. I said no one was destroying anything. The truth was simply revealing itself, and the truth doesn't need to raise its voice. The Miller family started talking about agreements, about unspoken promises. I let them speak. Then I placed the final report on the table. It was the bank's decision regarding the handling of collateral if the debts weren't paid on time. I said nothing more. I let them read. The air in the room grew heavy. Jackson lowered his head. Brielle went quiet. I knew this was the pivotal moment. Not to end things, but to open the final choice. I stood up. I said I hadn't come to push anyone into a corner. I came to put things back where they belonged. Jackson was still my son, but from today on he would no longer stand on my name if he didn't understand the value of work and respect. I spoke carefully, every word weighed. I said there were two paths. 1. To learn how to work from the lowest positions to understand that no one is beneath you if they're building something. 2. To leave carrying only what they had created themselves. Nothing more. I didn't call it punishment. I called it a choice. I looked at Jackson one last time in that meeting. The pride was gone. What remained was confusion and a very real fear. When I walked out of the conference room, I didn't look back. I knew that behind me everything had changed. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because there comes a moment when silence is no longer an option, and the truth, once revealed, creates its own order. After that meeting, I didn't go straight home. I walked a slow loop around the company grounds, an old habit whenever I need to think things through completely. The breeze was light, no longer carrying the tension of the morning. I knew I had just put a period at the end of one sentence, and at the same time opened another chapter. A harder one, a longer one. Jackson didn't come after me right away. Nearly an hour passed before he stood in front of me in the parking lot. The confidence was gone. His shoulders sagged. His eyes avoided mine. He didn't apologize at first. He only asked quietly if there was still a way back. I looked at my son for a long time. I told him there is always a way back, but not through words or titles, only through actions. The next day, Jackson showed up at the company's southern warehouse. No announcement, no ceremony. He wore a loader's uniform, faded, hanging loose on his frame. I watched from a distance. No one paid special attention to him. Out there, everyone was the same. Each person had a task, a responsibility. I saw him struggle, awkward at first, out of rhythm, then slowly, learning how to fall into line. Brielle didn't come with him. She disappeared from meetings and gatherings. I heard she couldn't tolerate waiting, explaining, facing questions with no shield left. The Miller family stopped coming to the headquarters altogether. The bank began its procedures. Quietly. No spectacle. Just stamps closing the chapter on a series of poor choices. My wife was different. She spent more time on something she rarely spoke about before. The janitor who had been disrespected that day was invited up to the office. A young woman, still shy, still unsure. My wife handed her the same folder she had once planned to give our son, not as a grand reward. She simply said it was recognition for quiet dignity and self-respect, the young woman cried. Not because of material value, but because for the first time someone had truly seen her. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't interfere. I understood my wife was doing what she had always believed in, placing kindness where it belonged. That eased my heart more than any business decision ever could. The days that followed moved slowly. Jackson began to adjust to the work. His hands blistered. His back ached. Some nights he came home very late, speaking little. I didn't ask. Some lessons can't be taught with words. They require time and sweat. One afternoon I saw him stop to help an older coworker when a load shifted. No one asked him to. He did it quietly. I turned away, not to avoid him, but because I wanted that moment to belong to him alone. The Miller family left the city. No goodbyes. I felt no satisfaction. Only the natural end that comes when foundations can no longer support what's built on top of them. I believe everyone must eventually carry the weight of their own choices. One weekend morning, my wife and I returned to the beach near where the wedding had been held. No music, no lights. Just the steady sound of waves. We walked slowly, hand in hand. She asked if I felt heavy inside. I thought for a moment, then said yes. But it was a necessary weight. Without it, I wouldn't have seen what truly mattered. That evening, Jackson called me. He said he wanted to keep working at the warehouse a while longer. He said that for the first time he understood what it meant to stand on ground he had helped build himself. I didn't praise him. I just said, I hear you. Our story didn't end with dramatic repentance or grand promises. It ended with early mornings, long work days, and quieter dinners than before. But in that quiet, I felt order return. I learned something at this age. Money can open doors, but it can't keep people inside. Only character and honest work can do that. And I also learned this. Sometimes the best way to protect what you've built isn't by holding tighter, but by letting go, so others can learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. As the sun sank into the ocean, my wife and I stopped and watched the horizon darken. No words were needed. We'd lived long enough to know this. If the roots remain strong, then even after storms, the tree will find its way upright again. If you've listened to this story until now, thank you for your time. If it gave you something to think about, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear it most. I didn't tell this story to judge anyone. I told it as a reminder. Money can build appearances, but only character and labor preserve lasting value. Never look down on the roots that hold you up, because when they let go, what collapses isn't your wealth, it's who you are.